Siseko is our moderator for today, and I would like to introduce him. He's here with us today. Siseko, could you take it off with
Thanks.
today's conversation?
Thank you very much, Puleng. Morning and welcome to our panelists as well as our participants for this morning's conversation. This morning's conversation is interesting for a number of levels, or a number of levels rather, because it brings together two interesting and useful contributions in terms of wooden carvings, specifically as an art medium in the South African context, and more importantly, and I think this is for me a really, really interesting one, the question of artists unknown or the unknown artist in the South African context. This conversation, of course, is titled Curation, History and Remembering, principally because of the kind of thinking that goes into the notion of remembering, necessarily as it is treated, for instance, in the scholarship of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, carried through in the scholarship of Sabelo Ndlovu-Gajeni, as well as in my own scholarship, where we think about the reconstitution of what we understand to be the ontological legitimacy of Blackness, specifically as this plays itself out within the aesthetic realm. Now, for a number of individuals who might have been following this year's public education program rather, as done by the JP Art Center, one of the critical questions that we've pivoted around is the question of the aesthetic and how the aesthetic influences the political. This particular influence or this particular relationship is interesting for us because of how within the aesthetic realm, and of course we see this as well even in Greek antiquity in terms of the writings of Plato, specifically in the Republic, the function of the aesthetic is quite useful in terms of how it informs and curates necessarily the ways in which the polity in the political realm relate to one another. This is once again reiterated in the scholarship of Drusilla Cornell, where she argues for the alignment of the ethical with the aesthetics, suggesting in many instances that this alignment facilitates a mode of relationality that curates a relationship that is non-violent between the self and the other. Why is this important, or why is this alignment important in terms of the work that we're doing? This alignment is important because of the historical devaluation that we've consistently seen in terms of Black artists and necessarily the kinds of contributions that they've made in the global as well as in the South African arts scene. This devaluation manifests or takes place in a number of ways such that we see in many respects the second leg of what we're going to be discussing or considering today, which is the concept of the artist unknown, right? And for me, this is interesting because of how in many instances that continues to devalue the kinds of contributions that Blackness has made, both to the aesthetic component in terms of the South African landscape, as well as to the artscape in South Africa. And of course, to assist me think through some of these questions that are plaguing us contemporarily, because I do believe that in facilitating said alignment, we are able to articulate in many instances a reimagined future and reimagined possibilities. I'm joined this morning by the Chief Curator of the Jabbit UP Art Center, Christopher Till, as well as Gerard Tekampa, who is working with the UP Arts Museums. I'm also joined by Funzo as well as Mambongi, who will be talking to, or who will be responding in many instances to a number of the complexities in terms of the questions that we'll be treating this morning in terms of our discussion, or rather this afternoon in terms of our discussion. And in that particular order, I'd like to start off with Christopher. Christopher, I'll give you 10 minutes to give an opening position statement. I'll then follow off to Gerard's contribution. I'll then ask Funzo, and then I'll ask Mambongi to conclude. And each of us could please take 10 minutes just to give a position statement in terms of the conversation that we're curating here this morning. Afterwards, we'll then sort of open up the discussion to more conversation, question and answers, taking some questions from the public or from the participants, as well as some objections and responses, and maybe even provocations from the panelists themselves in terms of the position statements that we'll hear. Christopher, I'll start off with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Siseko, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be part of this discussion, which from my perspective, I will anchor around an exhibition which is 101 conversation, because that process of selecting those 101 works included work from artists who are under discussion today, those artists who were working in the 80s, many of them, with the initial artists who came to the fore at that moment. They were included in this exhibition, and that was due to the process that we undertook in engaging with institutions and collectors and asking if they would nominate artists and artists' work that they considered to be of specific significance and outstanding in many aspects of what they represented. So the work of Johannes Maswanganye, Noria Mabasa, Jackson Hlungwane, and Johannes Sekhokhela are included on that exhibition amongst the 101 outstanding works. Now that is interesting in the sense that they come out of collections, and that raises how collections are put together and the manner in which they are put together. And the works that have been described here essentially come from public institutions. There are a couple, one there in particular, which is a private contribution, but it stems possibly from a period in the 80s when an exhibition was held in Newtown, and the curator of that exhibition was Ricky Burnett. And he, after having worked closely with David Rousseau, who was an artist working up in that area with the artists that he engaged with up there, brought this huge collection together. It came out as an eye-opening exhibition, because here was an enormous amount of creativity brought together, which people didn't know about. They were the unknown artists. And those unknown artists were suddenly thrust into center stage in an exhibition which was seen to be groundbreaking. And from that moment, the process of collecting work for institutions immediately identified that this was a moment where this extraordinary creativity to be engaged with, and to add these artists into what those actions were showing at the time. So I believe that the unknown artist is in a sense everywhere until they become known. And what is that process of making those artists known? From my perspective as a curator and as a director of art museums, it's been the role of the curator to seek out the creativity which exists within the environment that the institution is operating, and to bring them together in a way which allows the engagement with this work and the engagement of researchers, the engagement of the general public. And we've seen how artists have gone to enormous heights through that process. The Jackson Hlungwane retrospective currently on at the Norville. I haven't seen that exhibition in the flesh, but I've certainly seen the images. An extraordinary tribute to the creativity of a man's own tradition, steeped in his own religion, steeped within the engagement with his community, and brings that forward into something which sits within an art museum. And I think that idea of curation and how one goes about it is such a vital component of the unknown artist, which in this instance I've tried to demonstrate has resulted in the artists I've just mentioned from the 101 collection being included as amongst the 101 most important works which the participants in the process of putting this exhibition together identified. So it'd be interesting to see and to listen to the discussion from the other participants on the panel today in looking at these works and approaching them from a variety of perspectives in reimagining the artistic creativity which sits within these works, and how you look at them through a variety of lenses and what those lenses finally throw up. So I think I'll leave that as an introduction and listen to my fellow participants and their response.
Thank you for that, Christopher. And I think you raise a really useful and pivotal point, which is the role and function of the curator in terms of surfacing the kind of work of artists who have existed at the periphery and sort of bringing those artists into the mainstream in terms of the kinds of curatorial strategies that we use in the sort of established and mainstream art institutions. With that said, Christopher, thank you very much for those opening remarks. I now invite Gerard de Camper to give us his perspective. And Gerard has just curated that basement exhibition that we see at the Javid UP Art Center of the Wilton sculptures that we see down there. Gerard, over.
Okay, so I would like to sort of take what Christopher said, and I would like to go at the same subject from an educational point of view, more like I work with a collection, of course, that is supposed to educate the tertiary student, in other words, the university student onto South African art. And the problem I see within this, specifically my specialities are sculpture and ceramics. The big problem I see is that although you curate exhibitions, these really gets into the mainstream media, the mainstream, it doesn't come into the spotlight when it gets, for example, into the public domain. And I do believe, and I'll talk about that now, that there is certain reasons this does not happen. Because, I mean, I've seen wonderfully curated exhibitions, and I actually laud the fact that somebody has seen that these artworks are important in the South African context. The problem is if you now go to a sort of more public view of it, I mean, a work that would be exhibited in the 101 exhibition will not fetch a great deal of money on an auction, which actually, although it is, I mean, we don't in museum terms talk about value, it does show a bit of a disconnect between what the curators see as important and what the public see as important. And I believe it is a gap in education, not necessarily in the quality and the importance of the artwork. And my big problem with that is, how do we bridge the more educational, the academic side of this with the public side of this problem? Because on the public side, you do not see the same excitement about these works that you see in the academic sphere. And in the end, it's the academic sphere that needs to bring this to the public and make it important in the eyes of the public. And yeah, so that's where my whole view on this comes in, is that there is a definite lack in education on a more public side. And yeah, I'm not here to, I cannot go and say I've got a solution. I do, though, however, within my own sphere, see problems regarding this. Everybody that's at a tertiary education institution would know, for example, that if you would write a book about one of these artists, that you do not get the same reward for that if you write an article. But an article is normally in the academic sphere. If you look at a academic article, I mean, you nearly have to, if you're a member of the public, you nearly have to pay the same to see an academic article that you would pay to actually purchase a book. So it comes down to, in the end, that there is, for me, a disconnect between the academic and the public side of it. And for me, that is where we as curators and educators have to look at how do we educate the broader public in what I see as a treasure of South African art, but it's not in the public view currently. Sadly, if you look at huge and important exhibitions where you have these wooden sculptures in, the exhibition comes and the problem is the exhibition goes, because it is a temporary thing, an exhibition. And yeah, I would, my whole discussion and my whole thing around this is to see how do you bridge this huge gap that we see. Yeah, and that is sort of in short my 5 cents.
Thanks for that, Gerard, because I think one of the things that you then suggest here through your contribution is the ways in which, in many instances, art institutions play a critical role in terms of curating national memory, national history, and prizing sort of the kinds of national artifacts, as it were, even as these sort of show themselves up as artworks, how these are prized by these sort of art institutions and how it is that they function in terms of curating a national story, which is, again, of course, going back for me to precisely that question of the alignment of the ethical with the political, or the ethical with aesthetics, rather, the ethical here being denotative of the political, right? So how it is in many instances and what kinds of decisions we're making in terms of what sort of artworks are being included in the national story. Because if one were to sort of trace the South African historical narrative using artworks, one would be surprised at the kind of contestations and the kinds of questions that are raised by a number of artists. And here 2 artists come to mind for me. I think about, for instance, the work of Pierre Neef and his landscape versus the work of Gerard Bembu, for instance, and his watercolor landscapes, right? And the contrasts and maybe even contestations that one can sort of begin to identify within those 2 kinds of traditions in terms of how these 2 artists approach this question of the South African landscape in many instances, right? So you're suggesting here that in many respects, the works that we're seeing in our art institutions are works that tell national stories and national questions. But more importantly, I think for me, with that particular question of national stories and national history, becomes this question of which particular artists are prized, right? Which then feeds into that question of the known artists and the unknown artists, or artists unknown. Which artists are prized? Which artists do we see as having necessary cultural value in order to be included in these national institutions? And of course, you know, this is something that we've seen as well in terms of the Pretoria Art Museum and how it has negotiated, for instance, since the 1960s, in fact, negotiated the acquisition, for instance, of Black artists and Black artists' work, right, in terms of secretly acquiring those works, having now built up quite a reputable collection of Black artists in there. So it's those questions. I think it goes back to what Christopher was suggesting, the kinds of curatorial decisions that the curator makes within these art institutions in terms of playing their role in playing that national, in curating that national history and question. Funzo, I now invite you to give us your thoughts around this incredibly interesting discussion, and maybe to also inspire some curious thoughts further along these lines. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me, and thanks to both Gerard and Christopher for foregrounding the discussion, and of course yourself, Siseko, for bringing a discursive, philosophical, and highly theoretical aspect to the discussions. I would like to perhaps pick up on a few points that were raised by both Gerard and Christopher before I perhaps give my own position on how we can engage with wood carving artistic practices, specifically by Black artists. within an academic context. Just to start off with Gerard, this disjuncture between what is happening within perhaps the academic sphere and what you term to be the public sphere, I think demands a lot of interrogation, because the public sphere should not be seen as one unitary public, especially within a South African context where we know we've got segmented histories, segmented and highly segregated urban spaces and realities. So essentially, when we bring up the word public, we are not talking about some kind of monolithic, unified conception of a people. We are talking of different publics. And of course, what Gerard then points to is one public, which is the art market, which is a highly kind of elitist, highly white market, and how that public views the sculptures that are produced by mostly rural-based Black artists who are working in the medium of wood carving. So I think when we bring in that nuance, we'll be able to understand better some of the politics that Siseko is pointing to with regards to how these art forms are appreciated and of course then ascribed and written into history within the academic context. So I think indeed when we are engaging with education and thinking about how to bring these exhibitions and to promote these exhibitions through educational programs, we need to be really sensitive to the question of which publics are we talking about, and be very specific. Because as I say, in a country like ours, with the high degrees of segmentation that are there in our society, that kind of nuance is very necessary. And then the other part that Christopher pointed to, which is really, really important around new and alternate interpretations of these works, is also close to my heart, and I think a really, really important part of exhibitions, not only today, but also into the future, that will feature artworks that have been created using the wood carving process. Because we all know that the manner in which these artworks have been interpreted and written into history has been through a very myopic gaze that ascribed very problematic binaries based on kind of rurality versus urbanity, tradition versus modernity. And quite a number of scholars have pointed this out, that the moment you started to talk about rural-based or mostly rural-based wood carving art making, there would be ascribed really problematic designations or categories like transitional art or rural art, it may be. So I think it is critical that we try and find alternate, as Christopher has said, alternate interpretations. And this is where I will bring in my contribution. Is one of the ways that we can achieve these alternate interpretations is to perhaps look at intellectual traditions that have been neglected. And one of those intellectual traditions are, of course, by the very Black intellectuals that were close to some of these artists that are on show at the show that has been curated by Gerard, and the 101 that is the founding show of the Javet UP. And what one finds is when you actually peel open what the Black intellectuals or the Black scholars, the Black thinkers, the Black journalists, what they said about that creative legacy, that is where you begin to find these very redemptive, enriching, highly enlightening interpretations about that art. which have been ignored, which remain untold, and for the most part have been washed away because of the legacy of apartheid and the problematic art historical landscape that we have in our country, which has been dominated mostly by white practitioners. So one of the ways that this can be done, and of course the thing to say from the offset is to say this intellectual traditions do exist, that you do have Black intellectualism on Black art. The fact that it has not been adequately researched does not mean that it is completely absent. And so one of the things that we really need to do is to go back into the historical archive. And the same way that there has been a lot of work that has been done through such exhibitions as Gerard's and many others and tributaries before that kind of Christopher was pointing to, that we're looking to bring the artists to the fore so that they can be known. The same thing needs to be done with Black intellectualism on the very same art that is being celebrated, that it too needs to be dug up, and it too needs to be analyzed in a manner that will bring about those alternate and redeeming interpretations that we're looking for. And so very briefly, I can point you to some examples, and I want to go to examples that point specifically to sculpture, because this is what the discussion is kind of centered around, the wood carving practices by Black artists who are on show at the Javet UP at the moment, at the basement. And so when I looked into the Bantu World newspaper, for example, which is historically speaking, perhaps the most important Black newspaper of the 20th century, it was started in the 1930s through partnerships by the kind of Black intellectual vanguard of the day, and also some white investors as well. But the point is, it really cultivated and nurtured Black ideas within the paper. So you would find journalists and writers contributing essays and pieces that really reflected on Black life and all manner of experience, including art. And some of the articles that were published in the Bantu World during the 1930s, for example, engaged with this very dynamic of how do we as Black people, let me put it in that, how do Black people imagine and theorize their creativity? And specifically here, I'm referencing sculpture and ceramic, right? Because those were the practices which were pre-existing before the advent of what has been termed as kind of modern Black art. That means the introduction of kind of printmaking, painting, and those other kind of Europeanized forms of art making. And so you find very interesting essays that are debating what, as I say, what is the meaning of Black art that is being produced by these mostly rural-based artists. And one of them was published in 1930, if I can just get the reference correct, 1934. So this is a long time, and in many ways predates some of the white scholarship that so to talk about this creativity that only emerged in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Lisa van Rubrik does an excellent job of kind of cataloging this kind of white on Black scholarship. But here what you find is, if you go into the archive, you find that by the 1920s and 30s, already Black intellectuals were thinking very deeply about Black aesthetics and what it meant, what did these kind of wood carving practices mean. And as I say, one of those was done by Triple R Domo, was actually the brother of his more illustrious sibling, Henry Domo. These are some of the towering figures of what has been known as the New African Movement. But anyways, Triple R Domo wrote a review of the Bantu Trade Development Exhibition of 1934, which featured some artworks by Black artists. And in those artworks were of course some sculptures, and in there he goes into a really interesting kind of definition and classification of what does those forms of art making, what do they mean for Black people? And in many ways, it kind of juxtaposes it against what would have been considered at the time craft art, right? Or these kind of functional art. And for him, he says, no, that's actually not what it's about. That there's a power and an aura to this works that kind of transcends functionality, right? That kind of transcends this idea of traditional art making practices as being inherently functional. So I will conclude with another essay that was written in 1945. Which also looked at a non-South African artist this time, but he was an African-American artist. And in that essay, a very long essay as well, published in the Bantu World. And it also gave insight into what they thought was good sculpture. And what is quite interesting between these two articles published almost 10 years apart is in the second essay, good sculpture is considered to be representational. It's considered to be sculptures that signify an individual and pretty much the kind of public sculpture that you will see that catalogs your great leaders and so on. But in concluding, I just wanted to give that insight into some of the theories and ideas and intellectualism that exists from the early 20th century on Black artistic practices and wood carving practices specifically, as a way to perhaps go beyond some of the problematic concepts and categorizations that have been placed on these wood carving practices, which, as Gerard has rightly said, sometimes contribute towards these art forms being underappreciated. So I will leave it at that. Thank you, Seko.
Thank you, Funza. Thank you very much. I think you touch on an incredibly salient point for this kind of conversation that we're trying to have here today. And this is the question of the kinds of publics for whom we create these artworks, and the kind of publics that we talk about and that we have in mind when we are thinking around our curatorial strategies, specifically in art institutions. And this is interesting for me because of the assumptions, right, that we have made in the art world and the kinds of ways in which we have theorized Black artists. And I've always held in many instances that insofar as the South African art theory landscape is rich and textured, I think when it comes to Black artists, when it comes to theorizing Black artists, we haven't done quite sufficient work in terms of thinking about Black artists from where they were located, in terms of the kinds of questions, and Christopher suggests this when he mentions one of the artists who are on exhibition, on show in the 101 collection, which is to say that in many instances, when we're thinking about an artist and the kind of work that they do, we have to think about the cultural context in which they're located, the spiritual questions that they're asking and that they're dealing with and confronting, not only for themselves, but also for the communities within which they're located and immersed in. And this brings me to a question that I want to start now by opening up. Unfortunately, colleagues Mambongi couldn't be able to join us today for the conversation. So I'm just going to dive right into sort of the discussion at this point. I'm interested, Christopher, if I can start with you, I'm interested in the ways in which the kind of curatorial decisions that are being made, for instance, or that were made, rather, not being made, that were made when it came to the 101 collection, how it is that those curatorial decisions were informed by this question of understanding in terms of not only the artist, but also the kind of public that was coming into the Javid UP Art Center and into the space, into the museum, the kind of public that we have in mind and how we begin to sort of stitch this very beautiful national story, which I think the Javid quite pulls off quite nicely, if I'm being honest, but stitching this national story through sort of surfacing these kinds of nuanced and very, very different, but at the same time similar kinds of questions around the individuals, number one, that are exhibited, and number two, the individuals who are going to come in to view the exhibition. Christopher.
The interesting element for me in the selection of the works that finally made it from the 400 or so that were shortlisted was that they covered a wide spectrum of elements which we had brought to be measured against, and came into focus around certain thematic aspects which we then created conversations around between the works themselves. So within that curatorial process, we were trying to engage with the aspect which was demonstrated through the individual works, but put them in a way that they spoke to one another and created some kind of conversation. The audience and how this is communicated to the audience is of critical importance, and I think that's where the Javid is situated itself very firmly within the educational framework of demystifying and bringing the idea of what art is, what it represents, what themes it holds, what the social condition, what the political condition of the times were, and how these have been reflected through the creativity of individual artists. And I would say that the fact that we are all sitting in disparate places, engaging in this very discussion, is part of that process, which is being led to a great degree by Puleng in creating public programming, which sets out to identify how and who we can approach and what methodology we can use to demystify and not only give out information, but attempt to receive information from the people who are coming to view what has been curated, and to try and process that in widening the scope of understanding and also beginning to reflect the manner in which people approach work and how they can interpret that for themselves, or in fact assist us in interpreting how these echo and are responded to by a cross-section of a visiting public. So this is something which I think the Javid is uniquely positioned to do, particularly in the sense that we are connected into a university and we have the opportunity of engaging with people such as yourself and others who are working in a sort of a cross-disciplinary approach and are bringing to the fore the kind of questions which are being framed and what Funzo is referring to, where it's the kind of historical scholarship and the contemporary scholarship which is being brought to bear by what we put forward is of enormous importance. So it's a process. It's a process that the Javid is still exploring. And I think the fact that we have all been confined to barracks, so to speak, for so long and have had to engage virtually has also opened up possibilities for us, which we would not possibly have been pushing quite so hard. I'm not sure if that adequately answers your question, but I think it begins to provide the scope in which we're attempting to operate and how there is a multiplicity of engagement that we are looking to engender and receive, not only to give. So it needs to be a two-way discussion with whoever we are speaking to.
Thank you for that, Christopher. And you touch on something that I think is quite crucial, right? If we go back even at the moment, I've been pressed to revisit Plato's Republic, and Plato in Book 3, through Socrates, talks to the question of what I conceptualize as proper pedagogy, right? And proper pedagogy, of course, which is this balancing act, as it were, between aesthetic training, which is constitutive of the kinds of literature that we expose our children to, the kind of poetry that we expose our children to, as well as the music, right? And he suggests that it is through music that we attain a certain level of balance. And then he also suggests the component of the gymnastic, which then, of course, facilitates this kind of cultivation of temperance within the individual. But the question of education here for me is very interesting, Christopher. And here, Funza, I want to come to you for something that you raise in your, in your position statement, where you talk to the varied publics that we have to engage when we're thinking about curatorial practice, when we're thinking about even theorizing the artworks of Black artists. And the one question that I'm consistently coming up against and coming across is the question around, in the South African context, with the incredible diversity that we have, diversity that is at times even fraught with violent contestations, what becomes the function and role of not only the art institution as the sort of holder of these national artworks that begin to tell the national story, right? But what is the role of the art institution, the artwork itself, in terms of consolidating, I suppose, or possibly consolidating these different identities and creating the possibility for what we can understand as a national identity in the South African context? Because I do believe that in certain instances, we have fractured national identities. If you think about the kind of Zulu national identity that exists down in KwaZulu-Natal, the Cosa Nostra kind of vibe down in the Eastern Cape, as well as in the Western Cape, and then you move into the interior, and you have these kind of really, really fractured identities that themselves claim national kinds of frameworks and framing, right? To the whole point where the Zulus down in KZN claim to have a king. And some of us would even say that I am first and foremost a subject of the king before I am a citizen of the republic, right? So I'm curious around how the art space, the art landscape in the South African context begins to do that work of stitching together a national story that gives us a sense of nationhood as South Africans. Thank you, Funzo. Over to you.
Thank you, Siseko, but I'm not going to thank you for asking such an impossible question because it is such a difficult one around thinking about the nation. I think the first contribution there, of course, is to make is to understand that the very notion of nation is imagined. The very idea that we have a national kind of unitary South Africa is fictitious. It doesn't exist. But what certainly does exist is the symbolism, right? That somehow we can, from our diversity and from all our differences and ethnicities, cultural groupings, and so on, create some kind of monolithic national identity. It is just the symbolism of it that exists. So the honest truth is, it is impossible for any one artwork or any one artist or even any one cultural institution to try and create this notion of the nation. I think what we can certainly do is, as I mentioned, contribute towards a kind of symbolic reclamation of what it might mean to be South African. But if perhaps I were to take your question back to the artworks that are on show in Gerard's exhibition, I think what you begin to see is how these artists use very different kind of markers, identity markers, in order to assert their positionality within the South African context. And of course, most of these artists are coming from the Limpopo region, and we could even locate it further to the kind of Venda region. And even that word to say Venda region is imagined because Venda as a kind of space does not really exist anymore. The Republic of Venda was dismantled in '94 with the homelands being disbanded, but somehow that kind of national consciousness within the Venda people still endures, the same way that you've just mentioned now with the Zulu having their own idea of a kingdom and so on. So what you definitely see within the sculptures that are on show is how the artists are in many ways bringing in those markers into their art making process, and through the kind of materials that they use and the kind of forms that they arrive at. And I think this is all one can ask of an artist is to situate their practice, their creativity within their own personal subjective contexts, within their own community, and then it can obviously then go much broader to a more kind of national conversation.
I just want to bring a provocation before I move off to Gerard, especially around the concept of nationhood as imagined in the South African context. Number one, the first question I have is to ask the question of why would you suggest that nationhood is imagined? And number two, are we then, because for me, this is the interesting thing about the realm of the aesthetic, right? Because in many respects, what we see in aesthetic disciplines, this is music, artwork, poetry, literature, etc. And specifically, I'm going to speak as an individual who has been located within the literary landscape of South Africa, right? Serving on the Literary Association of South Africa. One of the key objections that I have consistently received from my colleagues is to suggest that literature should be used as an aesthetic object in and of itself, so it has no derivative political value. And I suggest, and I bring a vehement objection to that particular notion, because if we think back again to Plato and Plato's Republic and Socrates and how he understands the role and function of the aesthetic, in many instances, Socrates even is prescriptive, right, in the kind of artwork and in the kind of music and stories that we tell our children in order to be able to cultivate this particular notion of the city-state, the city that is, of course, bonded together by these national values that we inculcate through the music, the poetry, and the stories. So I'm interested in how you contest the notion of nationhood and suggest that it is an imagined kind of idea. And my question really seeks to find out then, Funzo, if nationhood is an imagined idea, how do we manage, in many respects, the competing identities that contest for hegemonic preponderance within this imagined national kind of framework? Because I think that in our ceding the point of nationhood as imagined, I think we give ourselves up to the possibilities of violent contestations, which we have seen, of course, in the South African context as they've played themselves out. So I'm curious around, as I say, this question of nationalhood, of nationhood as imagined, and what derivative implications we can sort of see as a result of continuing to stick to that particular position to say, indeed, nationhood is imagined. I wonder what your thoughts would be on that.
Well, I think the very basic idea, the very basic answer that I can give to you is if we look at the kind of history that we have as a country, where a certain type of identity was put forth as being paradigmatic of what it meant to be South African. And if you did not fit into that identity or those parameters, then you were not South African. And so actually many South Africans, quote unquote, who throughout the 20th century considered themselves to be South African were not in a literal sense South African. So therefore, they could imagine themselves as South Africans. And here I'm speaking very particularly of many Black people who were confined to homelands as their kind of citizenship and were denied citizenship to the country of South Africa and to kind of the urban spaces. So I would just leave it at that to say that if we want to provide very strict parameters of what it means to be a South African, and then to try and find those in visual forms, right? And to try and ascribe some kind of aesthetic to it and say, oh, actually, when you look at this kind of artwork, or when you look at this kind of form, that's what it means, or that captures the essence of being South African. I think we will be retracing some of the problems that we had. Whereas I think when it is left to the realm of imagination, being imagined, of course, we've all got national identity cards right now these days, and we've got passports and so on that give us very definite boundaries. But I think beyond that, especially when you're speaking in the realm of creativity, it is definitely the symbolic value and the imagined value that we are looking for.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Franz. I really do appreciate it. I think it's a useful. So you've cheated though, because you haven't answered the question. I see that you sort of cheated yourself out of answering the question. But this then brings me to you, Gerard, as the sort of curator of the basement exhibition. And one of the questions that I'm interested in is how possibly the ways in which our curatorial strategies play themselves out either reinforce or probably challenge certain established conceptions of and assumptions that we bring to particular art forms and art mediums in the South African context. As we've heard from Funzo's contribution, in many instances, there's a set of symbolism that is attendant with the kind of artwork that we produce, and of course the kind of work that symbolism then plays in terms of facilitating this idea of national belonging and national identity. So I'd be curious to find out from your side how it is that you possibly attempted to challenge sort of the historical tropes and historical assumptions around wooden artworks, around wooden sculptures in the South African art landscape, and how that particular work then feeds necessarily into the possibility of reimagining certain spaces in terms of how it is that art influences, as I say, again, the question of national identity in the South African context. Over to you, Gerard.
Once again, that's a difficult question, but okay, if we start with the exhibition downstairs, you have to, of course, imagine yourself in, well, not imagine yourself, but get yourself into this, the problematic space that we were in, exhibiting in the middle of a national lockdown, in regards to space, social distancing, things like that. And that's why we imagined a drive-in exhibition, of course, which has its own challenges regarding what artworks you can exhibit, because it's not an art, you can't exhibit an artwork that is too small, you can't exhibit an artwork that's too big, you can't exhibit an artwork that can't take the elements of being in a basement. So first I have to put that on the table, because that's obviously where my challenge started in curating an exhibition in an outdoor space where you can drive through, because, well, that was the perimeters given by the situation we're in. But firstly, my biggest challenge when starting this exhibition is I have sort of a pet problem within the national art landscape, is the whole issue regarding the exhibiting of Black art in a school or a district even, or a place. I mean, to give you an example, you have, the Polly Street Art School, you've got Roxdrift, but for some reason, and I do understand how it started to exhibit within an art school, but the problematic sense is that these artists get sort of lost within a bigger global art school. So in the end, the artists themselves doesn't come to the forth. And Fuzu talked about this thing of the markers of the artist, but sort of those markers disappears into a bigger landscape of an art school or an art grouping. And not necessarily an art grouping that the artist chose for themselves, but a grouping that was chosen for them by a curatorial practice. In other words, the only previous time I've been to an exhibition by vendor artists, it was called an exhibition of vendor artists, and in the end there was actually no mention of the artists. And that's where this whole concept of the unknown artist comes in, because it's sort of, they get lost within the bigger scope of things. And I mean, I say you will not. I mean, it's unimaginable if you look at white artists. They do not group Pierneef and Van Wouw and Vennen into the Rotterdam school. They do not, you know, they don't do that. And I'm asking, the question I was asking is, why do we do that to the black artists of South Africa? Why do we group them into an art school? What are we saying? You know, and that was my sort of start with this as an academic problem.
Is it not, for me, in terms of how I understand it in any case, is it not the fact that we have failed in many instances, both as art theorists, as well as art practitioners, as well as art managers? We have failed in many instances, and this is historical in this country. We have failed to, as was being suggested by Christopher, to have the bold kind of curatorial decisions to say, this is the kind of exhibition that we're going to curate, and this is how we're going to curate it. But more importantly than just making the decision of curating, also going into the communities and the contexts in which Black artists are located and finding out. Because in many respects, if you think about an artist such as Pierneef, the first thing that comes to mind is his biography, right? You know exactly who he is, where he was born, what his medium is, etc., etc. And in many instances, that's because Pierneef operates in a system that augments his artistic genius as a white South African artist at the time. So he has people who are profiling his work as he's developing his work in the first respect. He has people after he's done with developing his corpus of work, he has people who are then dedicated to studying his work, theorizing his work, from the understanding and appreciation of where it is that he as an artist is located, right? Informing, for instance, the ways in which his biographical information influences, for instance, his artistic practice. So have we not failed as artists, as artistic practitioners, as curators, as art historians, as art theorists? Have we not failed in the sense that we have not documented, we have not applied ourselves? And again, because of the resource restrictions and allocations that we saw in this country, where you had, for instance, and I use an example, Gerard Bengu, for instance, who comes up, who's a watercolor artist in the rural outbits of KZN, is trained in a missionary kind of institution, and begins to produce this kind of work. But without, and as he's producing this kind of work, nobody really is paying attention to who is this character, where's he coming from, what's he about, what informs his, I suppose, his interest and fascination with the rural outback landscape of KwaZulu-Natal, which he depicts quite beautifully, by the way. Nobody's asking those kinds of questions to then allow us, in many instances, to when we are exhibiting a Gerard Bengu, for instance, in the Javid GP Art Center, for us to have textured and layered conversations. We instead do the work. We ourselves, as contemporary art practitioners, fall into those historical tropes once more of just, you know, repeating to say, okay, Gerard Bengu, for instance, comes from this particular school, you see what I mean? We ourselves play into those tropes. So does it not necessarily, I wonder, this is just a question that I'm posing, maybe even to all of us, is to say, is it not necessarily that part of work to say we have to consciously work against the grain and work against the historical kind of institutionalization that made sure that particular bodies in this country were excluded from the art space, were excluded from the art landscape in the country? Just a quick response on that, Gerard, before I move on to the next question.
Exactly, according to me, shaping the grain. You know, we have to reshape that grain of thought, you know, that the whole thing of thinking of these artists within a particular space, in a specific particular, I mean, I'll even go so far, my whole interest started with Lucky Sabia, and him being spaced within the Poly Street Art School, and B, within this the framework of area Soweto, two things he's never been part of. So it's sort of, you know, he gets framed into that, and and the moment you sort of frame him into that, he never breaks out of the mold. He never becomes the important artist. He's, at least according to me, because he is framed as something that is sort of a decision made not by him but by somebody else. And yeah, that's why. So technically, all I can say to what you just asked is I agree. This is the problem we are stuck within, and if we don't break out of it, who is going to?
Yeah, absolutely. Funzo, I see that you want to come in here with a contribution.
Yeah, like Gerard, I agree as well, 100%. And going back to your reference of Gerard Bantu, there was an intellectual that actually followed his practice and was very close to him, Henry Romo, right? So I think our work right now is to go back and find out what were the conversations, because we do know that they interacted, and Romo is a towering figure, and we know that a towering intellectual, and we know that he did inspire some of Bantu's work, because they talked. And so I think the work that you point to of kind of going back and not recycling some of the problematic theorizations that have been made is to precisely go back to those Black intellectuals who did talk about these artists. So yes, I agree with you 100%, and it is incumbent on us today that we take on that challenge. Curators, cultural pundits, educators, we have to take on that challenge.
Fantastic, thank you for that, Funzo. And this leads me nicely now to a question that I'd like to pose to Christopher as the chief curator at the Javid, which is to say, Christopher, what opportunities is the Javid being presented with? As you say, and I've had the wonderful pleasure, for those of us who are joining us for the first time on this conversation, I've had the wonderful pleasure of sort of having this sort of continued conversation with you around the ways in which the Javid UP Art Center is positioning itself in terms of a contemporary national voice in terms of the landscape, the art landscape of the South African context. So what opportunity, and is there a possibility maybe even, of facilitating what we can understand as intercultural learning, right? Not only for the sort of art practitioners, but also in terms of for art historians and art theorists, where the Javid can begin to curate such conversations where we think quite critically around the ways in which we write artists into history and how we can maybe correct those modalities of writing artists into history, specifically, as I say, as the Javid is positioning itself and is positioned necessarily as a critical and key role player, I would suggest, in the national landscape of the art scene in the country.
To echo the earlier statement I made of the advantage of sitting within a university campus effectively, but with the foot in the street, presents wonderful opportunities for intercultural dialogue to take place within not only the university itself, but the international network of researchers on the continent and further afield. And we already are looking at ways of those connectivities being brought to bear with the Javid at the center of it. And we have forums being developed which engages with that network, firstly on the University of Pretoria campus itself, but as I've said, further afield. And that opens up enormous possibility, because you then become a beacon and a transmitter, if you like, of the impulses and the currents and the thought processes and the research ideology which is being projected by a vast number of people around essentially creativity. And what is that creativity? How is it articulated? How is it relevant to our own position, not only in the country, but on the continent and within the world? And that's why we've used the terminology of the art of Africa rather than African art, because it throws up certain stereotypes. And we're saying, let's abandon any kind of stereotypical usage of not only process but language, and redefine that, rewrite that, and represent that. And I think that's where we can continue these kinds of discussions and the approach which has just been articulated. I mean, just to take a half a step backwards, in a previous life, when I was then the director of the National Gallery of Zimbabwe, at the time, there was this whole thing of Shona sculpture. There's only Shona sculpture. There was an exhibition of Shona sculpture. Well, I looked at this and I said, this is ridiculous, because firstly, the people here are not all Shona people. There are Mozambicans, there are people from all over that area, and they've all been packaged into the same basket. And I set out to try and change that. And I said, we will not refer to this as Shona sculpture. It will be Zimbabwean stone sculpture as a generic. But further than that, I said, but we have to show the work of individual artists. And that's exactly what we started. So in a sponsored gallery space, I had a series of exhibitions by individual artists who then became known as to who they were, where they came from, what they were doing. And I think that earlier discussion flows into what we're talking about now. It's that continual re-engagement with the creativity and the articulation of that creative impulse in whatever form it is coming through, where the Javet can be broadcast that. We can broadcast that.
Thank you for that, Christopher. Thank you for that. Funzo, I'm going to come to you with this question as well now, which is to say, and forgive me for my assumption here, but as an emerging art voice, as an emerging art theoretician, as an emerging art practitioner within the South African landscape, what possibilities do you see for what I would suggest as intergenerational dialogue, right? So for instance, you have your seasoned practitioners, your seasoned art curators, such as your Christophers, and young people such as yourself who are coming up in the landscape and who are beginning to make an interesting contribution and voice. And the question I'm trying to pose really is to say, what are the possibilities as an emerging, as an individual who's coming into the scene? What are the possibilities of this intergenerational dialogue in the first respect? And more importantly, as a derivative of that intergenerational dialogue, does this intergenerational dialogue then facilitate this particular work that you're suggesting of reaching back, as it were, into what I conceptualize in my own scholarship as the Black Archive, right? So the scholarship of Odlom, or the scholarship of Omasila Ndongela, for instance, the scholarship of even your writers and intellectuals such as Eskiam Patlele, as well as A.C. Jordan, right, who are writing in the 20th century, and even going even further back to the 19th century, right, where you've got Ogopa, and some characters such as even Umkai, as well as Omake Mafuze. Is there a possibility, right, in your assessment at this point in time, of bridging, in a sense, and really fast-tracking what Christopher is talking to, right, in terms of articulating that creativity, in terms of where it is located, how it is manifesting, and the kinds of articulations that it is bringing into the scene? Is that work possible through intergenerational dialogue? And does that then augment this intercultural kind of learning that I suggest can be a possibility through institutions, for instance, such as the Javet UP Art Center?
Oh, certainly. And this conversation is evidence of that possibility. The fact that we are having this forum and this platform, and that Christopher is giving that insight into work that was doing already in the 80s, right? That in many ways answers some of the questions that we are having today. So yes, that possibility certainly does exist. And I'd like to pick up on one point that Christopher made, which is related to language, which I think is so important and fundamental, especially when we're talking about the creativity that's on show in Gerard's exhibition, by artists specifically kind of role-based and coming from the Venda region, is to then to start to appreciate what kind of language systems. Now I'm talking literally linguistic here, but also kind of visual. What kind of language systems are they using, right, to kind of codify their images? And are we able to tap into those language systems and not kind of impose some kind of foreign, problematic, and maybe very limited terms in order to kind of think through or speak about that that art? So I think for that intercultural, intergenerational intersectionality to really blossom, then we have to be very sensitive to the kinds of images that we are looking at, and be very sensitive to the kind of language that we are using to read those images and interpret those images. For example, there's just one image which I would really encourage the participants here and everyone just to have a look at, which is on show, and that is by Azufari Ragimana. He's one of the artists on show in Gerard's exhibition, and it's that of the drum. This massive, it's a beautiful sculpture of a drum, or also known as ngoma. And so what fascinates me is when you start listening to how music historians, and I think this is the part where you are so strong on, Siseko, this kind of interdisciplinary engagement, that this is, as art historians and as art educators, we really have to think beyond our discipline in order to make sense and appreciate some of these art forms much better. So for example, very quickly, ngoma, the way that, and I'll use isiZulu here because I think it will drive the concept home for most people, is there's a concept of beating a drum, which uyayishaya, okay, uyayishaya, you beat a drum, right? Versus ngiyayidlala, I play a drum. Now that nuance, right? And that's not the same thing, right? Mawushaya ingoma versus mawudlala ingoma. Two different things, and yet all of these meanings are coming through in the sculpture that we're seeing by Azufari Ragimana. So I think when it then comes to issues of interpretation, we have to be sensitive to language, as Christopher rightly pointed out, and I think this is what will bring about that kind of intercultural, intergenerational dialogue that we are so desperate for when we come, instead of kind of imposing a kind of hegemonic, problematic concepts that come from paradigms that are not suited to the type of art we are talking about.
Thank you for that, Funzo, and you begin to touch on something that is very close to my heart, which is the concept of language, right? And how it is that we understand the function of language in terms of informing some of the work that we're doing. And if you go a bit deeper into the analysis there, Funzo, so you talk about ukudlala isigubhu nokushaya isigubhu, right? So the distinction there, right? Playing and beating. And then the concept of ingoma itself, which is the musical element, right? In terms of what happens, what sound is generated when one beats or when one plays the drum, right? But if we even go a bit more even deeper than that, there's also the concept of ukungoma, right? So the music that comes from the drum as this healing, as having these healing qualitative or these healing characteristics within it, which is then why you have traditional healers in isiZulu, for instance, referred to as izangoma, right? Those who harness the beat of the drum in order to be able to facilitate modalities of healing and such that they're able to attend to a sick patient. So you begin to really see the moment that you get into sort of even in just a cursory form, a sort of cursory linguistic analysis, you begin to really see the richness and nuance that exists within the space. And this takes me now to you, Gerard. It brings me back to you, which is to say, what are the sensitivities maybe and modalities that we have to cultivate in this intercultural artistic exchange in order to understand and appreciate the alternative cultures in art, in terms of art mediums. And this ties in with a question that Tabang is asking here, which is to say that he appreciates, or they rather, excuse me, let me not gender people, which is to say that they appreciate the concern that you're raising around the homogenization of Black artists, right? Which also Funzo alludes to. And they ask then that as a curator, at the Javet, how would we go about instilling a curatorial praxis and or methodology in this art institution that is sensitive to and attempts to revise how Black artists are presented within the confines of the institution, as well as to the broader public, right? So it goes back to that earlier question, and Christopher did touch on this a bit in terms of his previous response. But what kinds of modalities and sensitivities do we have to bring in order to make sure that we do justice precisely in this work? For instance, as Funzo has just suggested, in that one particular drum, right? You have so many of these connotative and very, very interesting modalities of analysis that the artist is bringing when they are going about in terms of their practice and creating such a drum, as it were.
Okay, so firstly, when it gets to the sensitivities, that is the nature of art, of course, is that it brings to forward sensitivities, but also it gives us, of course, the luxury, if I can put it in that way, to understand how different people think. It is, therefore, for me, quite important, and in this case, it was quite difficult because of the current situation we find ourselves in, is to have the discussion regarding the actual artwork with various different people with various different points of view. When it gets to specific, let's take the example of the drum. I've learned something. And that is actually because I have never thought of it in that way. And that is a part of the like I said, the luxury we have is in learning. Although, you know, you have your sensitivities around it, it's a learning process even for the curator. It is a learning process for the viewer. It is a learning process even for somebody that has been in this sort of world for quite a long time. Each of us have different views about it, and that's what is nice about a conversation like this, because it brings out the difference in view. And the biggest the problematic side, part behind that is that the difference in point of view that, for example, even the four of us would have in this case is not something that is generally seen when you have something like a publication or something like that. Why? Because it gets polished. And you know, so for example, if we had this in even if we would publish something together, we would never see the difference in how we see things because it gets polished afterwards. Mm-hmm. And that is maybe the beauty in a conversation like this, where you have the conversation on a public platform, because you shape your views, you start to understand how other people think, and what, of course, the limits is of your own thinking within a sphere like this, because it is, and I actually think this is where the Javet actually plays an important role, is where we can get to this point where we talk about things that we have wildly different views about. And like I said, it's not the same thing. The written word in the end sort of shows a polishedness. And you don't understand, and doesn't bring an understanding of people's point of view. I mean, we've all were brought up in different ways, in different places, and for that it becomes a problem where we don't understand each other. And maybe this is exactly where the art plays an important role in. We earlier we had the conversation about the idea of a national art, the national identity, and for me, this is where the national identity comes in. It is a sphere that you need to understand each other and to understand where each other comes from, and the written word doesn't bring that understanding, but talking do. And I actually think when we look at the sphere we currently in talking to each other about a thing that we are all passionate about, but we have different views on it, is actually, that is where I think the Javid's got the biggest role to play, because nobody else actually brings these conversations to the forward. People are scared of them.
Yes, yes. Gerard, I'll stop you right there, because I'm conscious of time, and we are due to finish at 1:30. But colleagues, I'm going to invite you now to just give me your final thoughts in 2 minutes each. I'll start off with you, Christopher. Around, we've had a number of conversations or a number of themes that are popping up for me in this conversation today, one of which is the question of national identity. The question of national identity necessarily and rightly so being curated, both in the metaphorical and in the literal sense, being curated by curators and art practitioners, and how that then informs this ability of intercultural, intergenerational learning, as well as what I would understand as interepistemic dialogue. And of course, this interepistemic dialogue then starts necessarily by what, Christopher, you've always been suggesting, which is to say that we've got to understand the artist in order to be able to do justice in exhibiting the artist. So as a parting shot, what could the potential possibilities be in terms of running workshops now, in terms of facilitating training even, at a national level, at a national scale, that the Javid could be able to do that curates such conversations? Because I believe that we've built an interesting repertoire, or an interesting sort of a collection of dialogues and conversations around the possibilities and potentialities of contributing to fashioning some really interesting ways forward in the arts scene in the South African context, and even, as you say, globally and continentally as well. So what are the possibilities then of tapping into those spaces and tapping into our ability and the ability of the Javid UPR Center to begin curating national identity through the artwork that is exhibited and the exhibitions that are on show in the Javid? Christopher, just your final thoughts, 2 minutes at the very most, please.
Well, I think if one looks at the manner in which curators work and the exhibitions that are finally put together, they are there as, and you can only do so much in a certain period of time, not only because of the costs, that you don't put it up every 2 months and change and put another one up. If financially you just cannot do it. So I think the kind of platforms that we're developing here and the kind of dialogue which has been held today, which I commend my fellow panelists, has been very illuminating and engaging in a way that we're all trying to grasp. And I think it is through these kinds of platforms and engaging with not only ourselves, but to engage with other institutions, engage with artists, engage with those that are at the coal face of trying to articulate their creativity. If we can bring them into this kind of platform and to embroider and add to the physicality of what we have in various spaces at various times, but to engage in the manner that we have today, I think it's an enormous possibility, and the value of it for me is being demonstrated right now.
Thank you for that, Christopher. Thank you very much for that. Funzo, your last thoughts, my good sir?
Thank you. Your probing around the question of national identity is an important one, and I think in my stance would be the way that we can go about, I think, cultivating a less frictionless national consciousness, especially through the art and especially through cultural institutions. Yeah, sorry, I was muted there for a moment. So I just wanted to say, I think the starting point would be to acknowledge that the legacies of what it constituted to be South African in the past were highly problematic and limited. And to illustrate that to you, I've got one of the interesting books that I have here is called The First South African. I mean, just look at that in the life and times of Sir Percy Fitzpatrick, right, as being the first South African, and I find that to
that's laughable.
In many ways, it's quite comical, right? It's quite comical that he's considered to be the first South African, and I think that's the starting point. That if we can acknowledge that the kind of blueprint of what it meant to be South African was problematic to begin with. I think it gives us a better platform to develop as I say, to imagine, I think, a much more redemptive idea. And in many ways, the artists are leading the way in that. I think in some of the representations that we find, not only in this specific exhibition that is foregrounding our talk, but also in the one-on-one conversations, and I believe in many of the other projects that will emanate from the Jabat UP, will really help us to start to formulate that. And as Chris said, this is a fantastic start, and we can only hope that it will continue to germinate.
Thank you for that, Funzo. Gerard, your last parting thoughts.
Yeah, my last parting thoughts would be firstly, a conversation like this actually should actually also, I think, take place before the exhibitions, where we can actually talk about what we're doing, and because it actually just enriches what we are doing. You know, and I actually think even within the exhibitions, we should never, we should maybe move away from the polished answer, and actually have the conflicting views that we have on certain things out in the public. Because I actually think it's in some instances a very westernized way to polish your answer and then sort of give it. And I think in a country, as Funzo said, that is widely different, people actually part of the national conversation, getting people to become the national, have this national ideas, not to have the single idea, but to have those conflicting ideas out in the open so that we understand where each of us come from when we have an idea. And then, just my last remark, I think it is up to us to come together to write these histories, to present these histories, to re-remember these histories.
Precisely. And on that note, I think, you know, you strike an incredible chord there, Gerard, which is to say that the work necessarily of reconstitution and remembering, right? And a lot of us decolonialists have been doing this kind of work. And there's actually a very interesting paper that just actually came out with Imbizo a couple of months ago now that I did, titled Kauleza, an Instantiation of the Black Archive, that showcases how Black women theorized their lived experiences through music, even as they were excluded from spaces of formal knowledge making, that is the university within the South African context. Colleagues, on that note, I'd really like to thank all my participants, for my panelists for this afternoon's conversation. I am going to critique myself and Buleng here to say that we were naughty by having an all-male panelist, but for further discussions and further conversations, we'll have more gender parity and representativity. Colleagues, thank you so much for a delightful and insightful conversation. I wish you a fantastic weekend, and please, to the public that are joining us, please feel free to come in and view the exhibitions, both the 101 collection that is in the main gallery, in the main museum, as well as the wooden sculptures, wooden carvings exhibition that's downstairs in the basement. That's a drive-through exhibition, but one can also see that exhibition walking if you so desire. We welcome the public. The Jabat UP Art Center is open, is back in business, and we welcome the public to come through and really get a taste of some of the things that we've been talking about in person in the gallery itself. Thank you very much. Buleng, over to you if you have any final remarks or thoughts. All right, Buleng, I see, I can't hear you quite clearly. I don't know what's the matter with that. Buleng was just saying thank you very much, colleagues, and have a fantastic Friday afternoon and a great weekend. Stay safe and take care.